This is from page 282 of your wonderful book, Scale.
Thank you.
And this is not a contiguous excerpt. I read part of a paragraph, then another part of a paragraph.
Okay, sure.
So you wrote, quote, "With the development of language, human beings acquired the capability of exchanging and communicating new kinds of information on a scale and at a rate that was unprecedented in the entire history of life. A major outcome of this revolution was the discovery of the fruits of economies of scale. By working together, we could build and accomplish more with the same amount of individual effort, or equivalently, we could complete a specific task faster using less energy per person. We developed," and I'm skipping ahead a little bit, "we developed imagination and brought to consciousness the concept of the future, and therefore the remarkable ability to plan, to think ahead, and construct possible scenarios in anticipation of future challenges and events." So I guess my question here, it's almost like language, I guess itself, which is probably the most primary technology we use, really contributed to this discovery, I guess if it's a discovery of the future, right? So we have this, we started looking further forward in time through the invention of language, and then this started that bootstrapping process that we've described earlier, where we're using language to communicate, be more energy efficient, and then we figure out other modes or technologies or energy sources in the world that propel that virtuous cycle forward even faster.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I have a great question about this, but I'd like to maybe just hear your commentary on it.
Well, yeah, that was good. Actually, I like that. I don't remember that. No, I remember the thinking about that, but I don't remember those words. Yeah, no, it struck me, and I'm sure I'm not unique in this, not original in this, that once you had two things about language, I mean, among many. One was the first part of what you quoted, that by communicating, we could start to organize ourselves in order to address tasks together. So it cemented the collective behavior. There's no, I think, Ed Wilson, the biologist who just died recently, the ecologist, remarked something to the effect, there's no such thing as a single ant. Can't be. And I would say that you could say that about human beings. There's no such thing. I mean, I know there's the image that you can go be a hermit and live on top of the mountain and so on. But that's no longer the essence of a human being, if it ever was. Mm-hmm. Human being is essentially social. And before we discovered language, we were already social in terms of hunter-gatherer communities and so forth. But they really became effective once we could communicate and develop ideas. And this discovery then of what I call their economies of scale, that is, you and I working together can accomplish a task faster than each of us individually working separately. The image of all of us working together to build a house, for example, and so on. And that's what it is. That's what, of course, the social fabric is all about, and with explicit manifestations in terms of companies and other kinds of organizations. So there's that, but also the other thing about us, two other things about us communicating by language, is that we can develop ideas, and we do again, it's that feedback mechanism, create ideas together and figure out how to solve problems, to innovate and so on. It's the beginnings of innovation and invention. And so that's fundamental. And the last thing, which is sort of more philosophical, but also crucial, is, and you had a very nice phrase, invent the future. Because, I think it's probably true that no other part of nature, first of all, has the same kind of consciousness that we do. And it is not explicitly conscious of the future. We can fantasize about the future, by inventing it, so to speak, as you said. We fantasize about various scenarios that could be, that we want, desires, and so on. And perhaps in a certain way, philosophically, the most profound is that we are possibly the only creature that knows it's going to die. And that's the most profound thing at an individual level. Each of us knows that we're going to die, and we don't know when. We mostly try to put it off as long as possible. But, we are conscious of our own mortality, and no other part of nature is like that. And that has profound consequences, I think, for the way we form societies, the way we've developed cults and religions, and the way we've even invented culture. I think that has a profound. So language was sort of this, as you say, perhaps our first real technology that led us on this extraordinary path that we find that has ended up being the kind of existence we have today, that has separated us from the rest of the biosphere.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm led to believe that perhaps it is the human imagination that is our most powerful tool, right? To even imagine, I don't know how exactly language emerged, so forgive me, but to be able to create this psychotechnology that then lets us handle, coming out of the perceptual world and into the conceptual world, that we can now handle ideas and, run simulations and just think, right? I mean, that's so it's almost like the human imagination is just that theater, I guess, that we have that other animals don't. So we can just consider more of reality and basically outcompete every other animal.
Yeah, and I think once it began, once this process began of language, as you say, imagination, fantasy, thinking about the future, being an integrate experience from the past into the present and therefore into the future, and so on, and conceive of things, having concepts. Once it began, and it began by communicating with each other, I think, like many of these other things, it had positive feedback in it, and it exponentiated.
Right.
And, and it took us from being just a little bit different from animals, which was sort of pre the invention of of sedentary communities and cities. We were still really part of the, if you like, the animal kingdom. Once we became sedentary, discovered agriculture in order to allow us to be sedentary, and we took off from there. Then it becomes exponential.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm, so we are the animal that plays imaginary, I guess. I have a young daughter, so I'm very familiar with this. Like, she plays imaginary all the time. But when we grow up, we're still sort of playing imaginary, right? We've created these, Yuval Harari wrote about these in his book Sapiens, these imagined orders, as he calls them.
Sure.
But we have, nation states, civil liberties, money, human rights.
Sure.
And it's almost like we've created another strata of Darwinian competition, because now these imagined orders are competing with one another, right? We're trying to figure out which model works best.
Yeah.
And even it's still clearly it's ongoing, but it's fairly recent, as we've said, the past, 250 to 300 years that we figured out capitalism was a good imagined order. It actually has very practical effects in the real world. So this thing it's very interesting. We typically think of innovation in the physical space, physical tools, but more importantly is these imagined orders that we innovate. So,
yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, it's fascinating to think that, through all of the Earth's history, timescales have been, for things to change and for things to happen are, very large compared to the ones we're familiar with. Lifetimes don't matter. Individual lifetimes did not matter in sort of prehistory. And it's only recently that lifetime, in fact, right up to maybe, my own generation, so to speak, major innovations, took place longer than a human lifetime, up to now, up to maybe certainly the beginning of the 20th century. But sort of beginning through the 20th century, big innovations were taking place in timescales less than a lifetime. It's kind of amazing, which means you have to adapt within a lifetime. And that's something quite new and is possibly part of the kind of angst that is part of society, that we are, we have to be on our toes all the time kind of feeling, one way or another. And that's, that all stemmed from this discovery of language and so on. And so, as the time scale over which that's happened is maybe 10,000 years from sort of the discovery of primitive language and the development of innovation and futuristic thinking. And the other great marker is indeed the Industrial Revolution that we've talked about quite a bit in this. And that's only been, 200, 250 years. And so one of the questions one might have is, these are so small, these time scales, on typical time scales, which are often hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. Is this just some little blip that has happened? And it's an interesting, fascinating, exciting experiment that, we happen to be involved in, which is fantastic, but it ain't going to last. It's just, that's the big question.
Yeah.
Is it an interesting experiment of natural selection?
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's up to us, right? It's up to us to figure out.
No, we have, and that's the other thing. I was so much more, to some degree, and we don't know how much, we're in the driver's seat. We'd like to think we're really in the driver's seat, but obviously there are all these forces, natural forces at work, and we have to understand those. And but we are, more than any other organism, in the driver's seat. I mean, we can think it through, and we can, this new phenomenon of being able to think in those terms, and conceptualize and plan, actually plan. I mean, my gosh, animals don't plan, trees don't plan. We can plan and think about it and recognize some of these issues and some of the forces that are at work. And so it's important to understand those, because then we should be able to work with those forces rather than against them.
Right.
Yes. And I think that's sort of the trick, if you like, that we have to come to terms with. Work with the forces that are the natural forces rather than against them.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's what immediately sprang to mind there was flight, the concept of lift. That we tried to fly for a long time, but we really just had to work with nature. We had to figure out how to, you had to move the air under the wing faster than the air on top of the wing. That's what creates lift. So,
but that was great because we had to know something called Bernoulli's principle, which was that.
I didn't know that.
I mean, but, it was discovered by Bernoulli, and then people realized that meant that, maybe by developing fixed wings, you could actually fly, rather than trying to imitate birds.
Oh, right.
because we don't have the musculature to do that. There's no way a human being can fly like a bird,
right?
Unless you make a machine that's got
yeah.
it's sort of a,
So I'll read another excerpt here. This one is quite mind-blowing. I think you'll see what I mean. So you write, because the geometry of white and gray matter in our brains, which forms the neural circuitry responsible for all of our cognitive functions, is itself a fractal-like hierarchical network, this suggests that the hidden fractal nature of social networks is actually a representation of the physical structure of our brains. This speculation can be taken one step further by invoking the idea that the structure and organization of cities are determined by the structure and dynamics of social networks, in which case the universal fractality of cities can be viewed as a projection of the universal fractality of social networks. Putting all this together, we are led to the outrageous speculation that cities are effectively a scaled representation of the structure of the human brain. And then you go on to say, this is perhaps more than just metaphor and would mean that a map of a city representing its physical and socioeconomic flows is a nonlinear representation of the geometry and flows in the neural network of our brains. That's incredible. I'm endlessly fascinated by this idea of, I mean, it's just really the idea of fractals, I guess, that, you know, nature manifests itself in these self-similar but non-identical layers. And I wonder just how many dimensions of reality is that manifest within. And it seems like this might be the through line, right? There might be a physical connection here somehow between the structure of, say, the brain and the structure of cities, for instance.
So interesting that you quoted that back to me, because, and I'm glad you did, because it is perhaps the most really truly speculative part of the book, just that one paragraph. Mm-hmm. Because like you, I became very fascinated with fractals, both in terms of, you know, just the fact that they're all around us, mm-hmm. and with the mathematics of them, and trying to understand why is it that these fractal structures emerge. And we talked a little bit about that earlier. And it is related, I believe, to this idea of optimization, that these systems, these highly complex systems, with many components or many actors, if you like, many constituents, in order to carry out their functionalities and in order to optimize them, especially optimized in many cases because of some analog to natural selection, that is the survival of the fittest. There's some evolutionary pressure. In other cases, optimized like in a river, that in a physical system, that the most efficient way of getting water off the mountains down to the sea, is a fractal-like network. Mm-hmm. But so it was to do with optimization in general. But this paragraph was the recognition of something that had come out of the work that we did on cities, and that was that, which we had discussed earlier, and that is that the socioeconomic quantities, in particular, which are rooted in the structure and dynamics of social networks, because mm-hmm. that's where, in terms of this positive feedback that occurs, mm-hmm. giving rise to these superlinear behaviors, and the fact that all socioeconomic quantities, whether good, bad, or ugly, so whether it's GDP, a number of patents, or the number of the amount of crime or AIDS cases, all scale in a similar way, is because they're all rooted in social networks. Mm-hmm. So, but even the physicality of a city, namely the fractal network of roads, is connected to social networks, because those social networks have to take place and are facilitated by the physicality of the city. You have to be someplace and you have to travel between places. So these two networks have to be tied. So in other words, the physical networks and the fractality of them has to be related, and is related, if you look at the data, to social networks. So that was part of sort of the work that we did on cities. But then at a deeper level, there was the question, where does the structure of the social networks themselves come from? Well, that comes from the way we interact. But the way we interact is determined sort of by our brains. This was the idea, that we, our thought processes and so on. And so maybe it is that fractal network that exists in our brains, in our neural networks, is somehow manifesting itself in the way we form our social networks. This is not an original idea by me. It's an idea that exists in social science and psychology. It was, I was trying to remember the name of the person I got it. And I talk about it in the book. It's an idea that was developed by a man named Robin Dunbar, who's a professor at Oxford.
Dunbar's number, right?
Dunbar's number has become sort of in the business community, some of the, something that people bandy around. But what Dunbar suggested was that the structure, one of the structures of the social network in terms of its fractal nature is that, and I think we did talk about this earlier again, that, if you ask how many people are you closely connected to, well, that number turns out to be roughly between 4 and 6. Say it's roughly about 5. Those are people that you're really deeply connected to. You love, you express your deepest thoughts, if need be, to them, and you feel comfortable with that. And that's typically sort of close family members or 1 or 2 close friends, and so on. And then you ask, what about the next level? People that you are really, you're very good friends with, and you spend time with, maybe colleagues at work, you go out to dinner together, have parties together. That number's about 15. And then you have another layer, which is those that, yes, they're friends, they're colleagues, acquaintances. You see them at work every day, but you only see them at the Christmas party or whatever. That number is about 50, 45 to 50. And then there's a number of people that, you don't know well, but you recognize them and so on. Maybe they're, again, colleagues at work or your cousins or distant relatives you don't see occasionally. That number is about 150. And what you recognize about these numbers is they increase by a factor of 3. You go 5, 15, 45, roughly 150, and then there's a number around 500 and so on. And he tried to codify this, and he tried also to present data, pretty flimsy, may I say, to support it. And it was controversial, and it is controversial. Some people accept it, some not. I like it, because it fits extremely well into this work we were doing on social networks in cities. And Dunbar speculated that, and I also ascribe to this, that those numbers evolved from our hunter-gatherer days in terms of the way in which we attacked problems. Again, you had the hunter-gatherer group was about 150 to 200, typically. It varies, of course. But, it broke down into some close family pieces, and then pieces that were bigger and so on. So you had this kind of hierarchy. And he thought that that was sort of, since we were hunter-gatherers for such a long time, that was now encoded in our DNA and is encoded in the way our brains, our neurons have now organized themselves in order to deal with social phenomena. So it's a bit of a stretch, I must admit. I mean, not my work, but I like the idea. And I tried to pick up on it in writing this paragraph that, yes, let's take that seriously. That first of all, that these Dunbar numbers are for real. That's the way social structures are organized, loosely speaking. And that they are encoded in our DNA and therefore encoded in the structure of our brain. Therefore, if we take that seriously, we can go backwards. The brain, the structure of the brain has given rise to the structure of the social networks. The social networks, as I've said, give rise to the structure of a city and in terms of its social interactions, but the social interactions determine the physical structure of our city. Therefore, that physical structure that you see around you that has these fractal properties are actually a bizarre representation of the structure of our brains. So that was sort of of what I called outrageous speculation. And it is outrageous speculation. And one of the things that I haven't done is to try to take this a little bit further and think about it more seriously, actually, and to actually construct a theoretical framework, mathematical framework to put that into practice. But it's been on the back burner for me. But I wrote that. It was one of the times in the book that I sort of let my hair down a little bit, being truly speculative. But it's an interesting idea, an intriguing idea. And I have to admit, I like it very much.
Well, I'm glad you did it because, it's almost one of those like dim apprehensions or intuitions I've had about complex systems previously, but there's just a little more meat on the bones, I guess you might say, so I'm glad you did that. And let me think here. So there's a couple of things, because then that would also imply then there becomes this reflection like between creator and created, right? That the human brain sort of adapts to its environment, but the environment also adapts to the human mind. So there's this conformity, this dance always taking place, which is really interesting. And I talked to John Vervaeke about this to some extent, and he recommended two, I don't know if you've heard of either of these areas. One is niche construction.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And then the other one was material engagement theory. And I can't speak super deep to either one of them, but they sort of go to this point as well, that there's some, particularly with material engagement theory, it's like I guess it's positing is like, where do you draw the line of the human mind? It gives the example of the blind man's stick. Like the blind man is extending his perception into the stick as it touches external reality. It becomes part of his extended phenotype or something like that.
Sure.
So it's really interesting. It's like, where do you draw the line? We always say that the mind is like a head-bound phenomenon, but not really. If you're the blind guy, your mind is also in the stick.
Absolutely.
And there's many other examples. So it's just something I'm really fascinated by, because I'm selfishly trying to tie this back to, again, the corruption of money. I think money is a perceptual tool. So if we fiddle around with it too much, we can have, there's psychological consequences.
Absolutely.
Which could also be socioeconomic or city, all the different layers of the fractal. So that's interesting.
So it's interesting. The idea of niche construction, which is now, a serious aspect of evolutionary theory and ecology, is loosely related to my speculation. I mean, niche construction is that, animals or organisms, of course, have evolved in a niche. but that niche is not some fixed entity, because as they evolve, they affect whatever the niche is, obviously. They interact with it, they get food from it, they change it in various ways, by moving the earth or whatever, or eating other organisms that live in it. So they are, that's continually changing. But of course, that niche is also determining their behavior.
Right. Yes.
And so it's this, as you say, it's a dance between them. It's a continuous feedback mechanism between the two. And, so you could think of the city in that sort of image that I gave, the city of representation of our brains, as some, grandiose way of thinking about that, that we, in our own way, have created this niche, which we call the city. We once just wandered around in the natural environment, and we gradually changed that environment. That was the niche we evolved in at a certain period, over a certain period, and now we've changed that niche in a dramatic way, and that's the city, and so on. But that city, at the same time, that has, of course, during the evolutionary period, changed our brains, the way in which our brains have worked in order to deal with that, and so on. So it's not there's no chicken and egg here. They're together. It's they've evolved together, and I think that's so. As I say, niche construction is is an integral part now of biological thinking about evolutionary processes.
Yeah, I'll not leave you, but I'll give you one other deeper point that he gave me on this topic. I like that we're calling it a dance, actually, because he described it as like, okay, you can't really be a dancer until you're dancing. And at the same time, an area is not a dance floor until it's being danced upon.
Yeah.
So his deeper philosophical point was that identity itself is co-determining.
Yes.
Like the dancer makes the niche the dance floor by dancing on it, and makes themselves a dancer.
Yeah.
And that gets back to that kind of imaginary realm we're dealing with as humans, right? We're thinking like, what is this individual's role in the imagined hierarchy? It's imagined, but it's also kind of real at the same time. So let me ask you this then. Okay, so the social networks are hierarchical. They have to be, right? Typically. I guess there's ways to do it they're more or less hierarchical, I guess we could say. So is the geometry of a social network then, it's optimizing for something? I think it might be like between adapting to novelty versus maintaining some rigidity, right? Or there's some fixed structure, but it also needs to be able to respond to or adapt to novelty itself. I'm thinking here, is this similar to like, is there a physics to that? I guess because you described Dunbar, like he's saying that, this just emerged from our hunter-gatherer past. I'm wondering if there's a deeper physical, and I know we're just speculating here, but could there be a deeper physics principle behind this? Where I'm thinking like something like the geometry of a social network or a human hierarchy could also share some physical principles with like the river basin, right? That it's kind of optimizing for flow, but it also needs to have branches to distribute some of that flow from the main channel, et cetera. Not a fully formed question there, but I'd love to, it's a speculation, I guess, on how much physics is involved in the structuring of social networks. I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, when I remarked earlier that, something went on the back burner to think about this sort of outrageous speculation, as I called it, was in fact to try to formalize and understand the origin of things like the Dunbar numbers. They're not just arbitrary. In other words, I take a physicist view. None of these numbers, none of these things are arbitrary. There has to be some principle or some dynamic that leads to it. And, from my perspective, and I think typically it would be a physicist's perspective, something is being optimized here, whatever it is. I mean, in this multidimensional space in which these systems live. So, going back to something first a little more mundane, in terms of cities, for example, if you ask about just the physical networks, the roads and so on. Now, presumably, one of the things that evolved, that was crucial in the evolution of those structures was the idea that anybody moving from A to B wants to do it in as short a distance or shorter time as possible. So you can imagine that system evolved by optimizing over the entire system, the entire community. Can you optimize in such a way that any two people, any person is trying to get between any two places as quickly as possible? And we've made some progress on that, and I would say that it's very likely that is the case in terms of the kinds of transport networks. Now, of course, you realize again, I have to put a big caveat in this that I've said earlier. This is very coarse-grained. I mean, it's very low resolution because you have geography. You have to go around things,
right,
and so on and so forth. But roughly speaking, and in fact, work that we did a couple of years ago showed that within cities, the pattern in which the flux of people moves on the average in terms of how far they have to go and how frequently they visit places is actually determined in this way by some kind of optimization that's going on. So that's kind of a physical aspect to it. But then you can ask, what about in terms of the social network, in terms of the interactive social network between people? What, if anything, is being optimized in that? And, the speculation there is that what is being optimized is possibly that the network is such in order to facilitate maximum social interaction. You want to maximize the way in which people can interact with each other. And at the same time, and this is really sticking one's neck out, that in terms of some social good or some even material good, people want more. Each person wants to get as much as possible. Sort of a, for want of a better phrase, a kind of greed hypothesis. And then without, I use the word greed, which of course has a kind of pejorative implication, but just that you want more. And,
self-interest.
Yeah, you're out of self-interest. And so the system adjusts itself so that on the average, each person is getting, as much as they possibly could, so to speak. Now, there's huge variation in that. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the extraordinary hierarchy of, there's obviously extremely rich people and there's very poor people, and so on. But, so one of the things that is begging to be investigated is exactly this question. Do these regularities in this coarse-grained way, such as, let's assume the Dunbar numbers are correct, what has been optimized in leading to those numbers? Why 5 for sort of the smallest group? And why does it go up in factors of 3? Where does that come from? So, and just to hark back to the beginning of our conversation in terms of the biology, that was the question I asked myself, why the numbers for all those scaling laws in biology had 1/4, number 4. And that we were able to understand in terms of the dynamics of the kinds of networks that sustain biological life. So, coming back to the socioeconomic systems we have, and something like those Dunbar numbers, somehow ultimately it is the integration and tension between, on one hand, the physicality of the system. That is, it's the constraints of having to be in a place and having to travel from A to B, and the thermodynamics of that, the energy uses, and so on. So that's sort of kind of its physical aspect. So the tension and integration of that with the information exchange that takes place in social networks, and what that leads to in terms of optimizing that exchange of information in order to get more, and that more could be more ideas, for example.
Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin.
So that's the kind of thinking that I would like ultimately to be able to put into a more formal, it'll hardly be rigorous, I'll use the word rigorous, but a more mathematical framework in order to understand these questions.
That's fascinating. I'd never conceived of it like that. So it's perhaps the tension between physical possibility and informational throughput, something like that.
Yeah, sure. Yes.
That's so interesting, because that might be an interesting thread to pull on for the consequences of the digital age, right? The fact that we've removed a lot of the physical constraints from social interaction. There's trade-offs, of course, like what us having a Zoom call is not the same as us sitting in a room, but that's really fascinating. I never thought about that.
So that's one of the questions you're touching on there that I don't know the answer to, is exactly that. Is there, has the digital age, the IT revolution, changed all this? Because it certainly has relieved us of place. Here we are, having a conversation, but we're, I don't know, whatever it is, 5,000 miles or whatever it is apart, but we can have this conversation. And so it's relieved us in a certain sense of place, but as you say, it ain't quite the same as us being in the same room together, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's it's kind of, it has more than a single dimension, this thing. It's not just that we're not three-dimensional, but it's much more than that. It's got a whole kind of social dimension that's missing from it. But nevertheless, it has decreased physicality. On the other hand, it's increased information exchange, obviously. I mean, the digital age, we have much more information flowing and so on. And, what is that doing to this? Is that a fundamental change? Is it going to change anything really? And I don't know if I talked about this, but I did talk about it in the book. I did think about this when writing the book. And at first I thought, gee whiz, that is going to be that is a truly profound change. And everything that's happened up to now is going to be dramatically transformed. And then I started thinking about it. I thought, a much bigger change, is what I discovered, took place in the 19th century with two things that happened. The invention of the telephone, which meant that, I mean, up to the telephone,
Letters, right?
You couldn't, you had to be in the presence of someone to actually interact.
Mm-hmm.
You could send a letter. Well, if you lived in the same city, that, in good postal systems, that could actually be sent in the morning and delivered in the afternoon, but mostly it was the next day.
Mm-hmm. And
if you lived in another city, it might be 2 days or 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
If you lived in another country, it might be a month.
Mm-hmm.
We changed that in one, and that was Maxwell with his electromagnetic waves, they're going to transmit. We had this, that you could have instantaneous interaction, even though you were not in the presence of the same person. And very quickly, we were able to do that, across the Atlantic. So that was extraordinary. I mean, that was nothing close to that had ever happened, and that changed everything. But the other thing that happened before that was, of course, the steam engine, the contraction of space. That the vast majority of people never moved more than 10 or 20 miles from where they were born in their entire life.
Right.
And suddenly, well, not suddenly, but gradually, most people could, if they wanted, interact, go and meet with someone 100 miles away. And in the United States, 3,000 miles away. It would take them time, but they could do that. And, that had never happened. It was always walking or at best horseback. And so that changed everything. So these were extraordinary revolutions, the contraction of space and the contraction of time. And those, I think, were greater revolutions than the internet, actually, even though the internet has, made it even much more global, of course.
It almost as if. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Because
I was just going to say that it's almost as if those were the 0 to 1 innovations, and the internet is like just a degree, right?
Yes,
this is still the telephone, effectively, but it's just higher resolution and all of that.
That's the way I began to think about it.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing it as a 0 to 1, 1 to 2, to take that, it really was 0 to 1, and then you've embellished in a marvelous way on the 1, so to speak, in a marvelous way. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. But the real revolution was the 0 to 1, the contraction of space and time.
Yeah. Excellent points. I'm going to, if you don't mind, take this opportunity actually, because I think this tension between physical possibility and informational throughput, I'm going to just think out loud here, but I think this is key to, I think this has an effect on money as well. And I'll try to explain. I know you mentioned your fear of money, but I'll try to make it very,
yes, I'm afraid
very clear. So basically gold was selected as money because it was really good at holding value across time, right? It's something that we couldn't increase the supply of no matter how hard we tried. It had some other characteristics, but we could say that should suffice for now. Gold was the best store of value money historically. The problem with gold, though, was its physicality, actually. Like that's what gave it, that's what made it impossible to counterfeit, was that it was physical. But when the world starts to connect itself in via telecommunication channels like the telephone, telegraph, internet, et cetera, the physicality of gold ends up being something that holds it back, actually, because you can't send gold around the world. It's hard to support a globalizing economy on a physical money, let's say. So that was the impetus to create gold-backed currency instead. So we could have a form of money that you and I are just sending ledger entries to one another effectively, right? Debit your account, credit my account. Yeah. So we have a lot of informational throughput by decoupling ourselves from the physicality of gold. But that, of course, introduced the problem that now you're trusting humans with the supply of money instead of trusting nature, as we were with gold. So there's a tension here again, where the physical possibility and the informational throughput, caused gold to become money. Then we needed to scale gold and currency, but now that's completely gone off the rails. We've decoupled money from gold entirely, and now money supplies worldwide are being expanded at a rate unprecedented. And just to try, we talk about in Bitcoin, giving people the orange pill. This might be the great place to try and give the orange pill. It's like, okay, Bitcoin is just a tool that holds a fixed supply. So it holds its value across time, but it's pure digital information. So you can beam it across space. So it's kind of the middle way between gold and gold-backed currency. And maybe a simple way to say that is like, money is a tool for moving value across space and time. Gold was good at time, but not space. Currency is good at space, but not time. Bitcoin's good at both. But I never was able to form that until you just now highlighted this tension between physical possibility and information.
That's really, yes, no, that's a very interesting way of looking at it, I must say. And indeed, one of the things I've had trouble with thinking about money conceptually is that even before Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, whatever, was its abstraction. Mm-hmm. That it was no longer wasn't tied to gold, but it was only loosely tied to work and energy. Mm-hmm. Material things, that and trying to figure out what that meant a little bit. And then this new thing came along that made it even more abstract. And now it's true that money in this form is, so let me back off a second. When you get if you're salaried and you get paid, there's sort of an implication there that what you got paid for the work that you did. It's very, mm-hmm. There's sort of one-to-one, there's a feeling there's some kind of one-to-one correspondence. Mm-hmm. Originally it was, if you dug ditches, it really was the work that you did. Mm-hmm. Then it became a little more abstract that if you're a manager, well, you're doing a different kind of work. But still there was this image, this idea that, mm-hmm. It's in many of our minds actually, that it's tied to, work, production, and mm-hmm. so forth. But then, of course, it's gone way big. It gets much beyond that, where now money, even before, as I say, Bitcoin, it starts to become quite abstract in terms of once you have ideas of investment. For example, Warren Buffett's one of the richest men in the world, but in terms of the old ideas about work, he's never done a day's work in his life. In that sense. Mm-hmm. So the Marxist view of money mm-hmm. as labor kind of mm-hmm. thing, which is very 19th century, and not recognizing the role of investment as work and as part of the lubrication mm-hmm. of a capitalist economy. Mm-hmm. And now we've gone one step beyond that, it seems to me, that it's now not tied to any of those things. It's sort of itself. And indeed, it is information because it's stored in some digital form. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. It's not, and yet it obviously is still related because presumably if you have cryptocurrency, there's an exchange rate, mm-hmm. whatever it is, that seems to fluctuate enormously, mm-hmm. that relates it back to what many of us think of as a dollar bill kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I'm still struggling. Frankly, I'm still struggling with that, is to try to see what it is and what its implications are. And I confess, I do not understand it.
Well, your intuition's spot on that gold was, we often say this dollar, people say, oh, a currency backed by gold. The question really is what's backing the gold? And that was energy, frankly. You know, it was, you know, no matter how you expended your energy in the world, if you couldn't find something more profitable, frankly, you were either employed in something more profitable than gold mining or you were mining gold. Gold was like kind of the backstop to energy expenditure, something like that. But that energy expenditure is exactly what secured its supply. That's what made it a good store of value. But when you then decouple that and you just give the authority to issue money to a government with no energy expenditure, you get, well, clearly it's a very perverse incentive, because now there's one group of people that can just confiscate the energy of others by printing money effectively. And that's what's happening right now. You know, it's rampant. But Bitcoin gets us back to that principle of gold, actually, because you have to expend energy in Bitcoin mining to create Bitcoin. So it's not, I mean, it's a clearly it's a major innovation, but it's really just adopting or reusing or recycling these old principles of gold just in a new digital form. So, okay.
It's quite fascinating. And of course, it's one of the, like gold, I mean, the other thing about gold, of course, was that it transcended national boundaries.
Yes.
I mean, and that was one of its great attributes, an important one for international commerce and so, etc. So it had a kind of universality associated with it, as weird as it was to have, you know, this piece of metal. Sort of the representation of that is was always, I think, struck everybody as strange, but nevertheless, it was agreed upon. And the thing about this new internet currency is that it is also global and transcends all boundaries and is independent, actually, of national currencies. You know, and the question is it going to supersede them and become something that, you know, some guys, you know much better than I mean, I hardly know this stuff, but, you know, some countries are beginning to sort of think about adopting it in some form of their currency, and goodness knows what that will do.
Yeah, it's a rabbit hole, as we say, and
I keep thinking, by the way, no, you know, I know nothing about. I'm hopeless at finance, and I sort of dealing with money, but I have thought, in terms of trying to understand it, maybe I said it earlier also, maybe I should buy some, you know, just see what happens, just see, you know, I'll probably lose my password or whatever it is you have to have. You know?
Yeah, there's fortunately there's a lot of businesses that have emerged that help you custody and do all the things. But yeah, you can also self-custody. I mean, I think that's how a lot of people get involved in it, is you end up just buying some out of, either you're speculating on the price or you just buying it out of curiosity, but you know, that entices you to think more about it. So
that's what I thought, just to learn about how it works and so on.
Yes, exactly. Let me try to read one more excerpt if you've got time for it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
You wrote that, this is page 316 in your book, all socioeconomic activity in cities involves the interaction between people, employment, wealth creation, innovation, and ideas, the spread of infectious diseases, healthcare, crime, policing, education, entertainment, and indeed all of the pursuits that characterize modern Homo sapiens and are emblematic of urban life are sustained and generated by the continual exchange of information, goods, and money between people. What I was thinking about here, first of all, the primacy of exchange. I think exchange is such, it's so fundamental, almost like everything, and to be very macrocosmic about it, it's like the only thing that never changes is change. And change itself is driven by exchange. You know, there's energy, everything's interacting with everything else constantly. I guess the question I'd like to ask you is about emergent properties. That emergent properties seem to be derived from relationship, right? So instead of an emergent property just being, I guess, the rough description 1 + 1 = 3 type of thing. I'll let you correct that description if that's inadequate. What is it about exchange that allows elements in a system to become more than the sum of their parts? What is it? There seems to be something almost, I don't want to use the word mystical, but something so deeply fundamental about this concept. And then as a follow-on question to that, it's like, okay, we know that also exchange, the more free exchange we have, the more wealth creation we have in the marketplace. So it's interesting to me that there's this fundamental reality of exchange, and then somehow by acknowledging and honoring that reality, we create the very practical result of more wealth. So what is it about, I guess you could maybe say wealth is an emergent property of exchange, but I'll leave it at that and would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, let's see. So yes, so it is the very essence of what a network is about. I mean, that's why networks underlie all this, because they are the formal representation of exchange mechanisms between individual constituents. And, and a social network is one manifestation of that. You can, just in the physical world, if you take, let's take something like, a nucleus of an atom. So that contains protons and neutrons. And they, one way of thinking about it is, well, they stay together because there's a force between them. But in fact, if you dig deeper, that force is arising because of the exchange between them of something we call mesons. Okay? Another particle, they exchange them, between them. And the image that, the sort of cartoon version of that is that, consider two people, two children, for example, and there's a constraint on them. They have a ball, just a tennis ball, say, and the constraint is that they have to throw the ball to the other person, the other child or the other person. And as soon as that one catches it, that person has to throw it back to the other one. And they have to keep doing this. Well, they're forever bound together. I mean, there's a force between them, which is actually, you don't think of that as a force, but it's a force, that rule. And that's what protons and neutrons do inside a nucleus. They're continually exchanging these mesons, and that's the rule. That's the rule of the fundamental forces of nature, that they have to exchange mesons, and that manifests itself that they are attracted to each other by this having always to exchange. So that's the most primitive version of exchange. But if you then have many of them, as you do in the nucleus, not just between two, but between many, that forms a kind of network of this sort of bouncing. There's these balls are bouncing between them. So in a social network, that ball is information. We are exchanging information continuously between each other, and in some curious way, that keeps us bound to each other in one form or another. We are, in this metaphor, we're sort of like these little machines that have to send out information to some other person in the system, and he or she has to send out information to another one. And that keeps us all bound together. And in some sense, that's what a city or a social organization is. And the only thing that is not invoked in that, and what distinguishes us from the protons and neutrons in the nucleus, is that as you exchange in a social network, that exchange of information increases as you get more and more people. And that's that positive feedback. And that produces more. And and by producing more, you have, if you start with a small community, you have this kind of emergent phenomenon of a city. So, so it's that the positive feedback involved in that exchange is the driving force that leads to whatever the emergent phenomena are. And those emergent phenomena could be the city itself, or it could be a business that evolves within the city, or it could be, a social riot that takes place, or whatever. So, I'm trying to give a kind of a simplistic version of the dynamic that is part of what happens in any adaptive system. And adaptive is important here because there really are external forces that are at work here that are both between people, but between groups of people, that there's competition and the evolution of the system as it deals with the changing external environment, which we talked about earlier. That leads to the need to adapt, and these positive feedback mechanisms leads to innovations to deal with the changing external environment.
That's fascinating. So, and the positive feedback, so that in this exchange then, in particular in a social network, and the rough analogy I'm thinking in my mind here for positive feedback is like, if you get the microphone too close to the amplifier, right? It has that positive feedback up to a screech.
Yeah. Right.
There's some amplification occurring at each exchange. And then the faster that exchange, or the higher the intensity of exchange, the more that amplification. Is that roughly it?
Yes, indeed. No, so when a group of people get together and there's interaction, it doesn't stay. It cannot stay static. It builds on itself. Now, most of what it builds on is, what the result is totally uninteresting to, anyone else, and it may be uninteresting to the people, but it does build on something, and something changes and something evolves from it. And the system is continually doing that. So, and I often say, that dynamic, that building, that continuous sort of buzz and conversation that is taking place, as I say, mostly doesn't lead to anything of interest to anyone else or even the entire system. But every once in a while, it leads to, the theory of relativity or the invention of Google. Right. Or, that's the phenomenon that takes place. And society facilitates that by creating either formal institutions to facilitate that, like, office spaces and lecture halls and universities and theaters and sports stadiums to bring people, to sort of stoke the fire, stoke the cauldron, get those, the crucible acting. That's what social organization does, and and that's why we have these organizations. That's why we have companies and cities and so on. And but it also does it in informal ways by having, coffee bars and Starbucks and restaurants and plazas in cities and parks. It's all there from this perspective in order to increase social interaction and increase the continuous feedback mechanisms, with the idea that it might affect an individual's life, But I suppose in the overall scheme of things, to make some major transition to something, that you create something that's going to affect everybody's life, like, you know, an Amazon or a Google or quantum mechanics or whatever.
It's very fascinating. And so one last question about this, and I'll let you go. Positive feedback, we call it positive feedback, but it can have, that's just the positive in the sense that it's amplifying the signal.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, it could be quite negative.
Positive or negative results.
Oh, absolutely. Right? Yes, I'm sorry. That's a very good point, and I wasn't thinking of that. Yes, I was using it in a kind of technical way that it amplifies, but it, of course, can have highly deleterious effects. Clearly, I mean,
depending on what we're amplifying, right?
And what we're amplifying, yes, absolutely. Oh no, absolutely. I'm sorry. I know I never thought about that. I apologize that I was using it in its kind of engineering, technical sense.
No, I think you may have actually said in the book to that effect that you mean positive just in the sense of amplification.
Yeah, good. I hope so.
The question I would ask here is then, in the domain of social networks or human hierarchies, is this speaking to the importance of what ideas we're amplifying? Like, I'm thinking of, you know, Marxism, right? We had this beautiful idea of from each according to their ability to each according to their need, but we amplified that signal, and it turns out that was disastrously wrong, right? It just didn't work. Is that what this is? Yeah,
absolutely. That's an example of it. I think on, you know, National Socialism and so on, or whatever. I mean, you know, political movements are very good examples of that, of course.
Right.
So you know, it certainly can have disastrous effects, and so there's no, you know, there's no judgment on this.
Right.
There's no judgment call that it's positive feedback does not mean positive in the good or bad sense.
Right.
Moral or ethical issues.
You
know, I mean, it's sort of interesting. You know, I mean, religions probably started this way, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And one of the questions you could ask that I have often wondered about is I hate to say this is a terrible thing to end on, really. It's quite controversial. You know, was that positive or negative in terms of judgment? You know, I mean, you know, we've had these major religions, but actually in terms of, you know, good and bad, were they actually, was it a good thing?
Right.
You know, it ended up, I mean, after all, Christianity led to great works of art and cathedrals and all wondrous things, people doing good acts and so on. Yeah. But it also led to terrible wars and the killing and persecution of all kinds of people, and so for no good reason.
Right.
And so, you know, I've often fantasized about, you know, is it possible to, you know, make a ledger where you take a religion, say, just as an example, or a political movement, and you put on one side the good, and you give it some value. You know, Christianity, well, it built these, as I say, it built these great cathedrals. It had all the great music and the great art. And on the other hand, you know, it created terrible wars and terrible persecution, and you give some negative number and you add it up with the ledger. So if God in his infinite wisdom presumably has done that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I just, I guess the point is we just have to be very selective about what ideas we amplify in our social networks.
Exactly. And I think that's the point. That's, I mean, I was making as being a bit cavalier in my trying to joke about it, but no, in all seriousness, no, we have to be very careful about the ideas we amplify and what happens to them. Human beings have done terrible things, and we're going to do them again, no doubt. And we've done some wonderful things, and you know, the onus is on us collectively to amplify the good and minimize the the bad or the negative. Easier said than done, obviously.
And there is the plight of human history in a nutshell.
Exactly. Indeed.
Geoffrey, I've very much enjoyed this conversation. Is there anything else you wanted to leave? A note you wanted to leave?
Just to say thank you very much for inviting me, on your show, so to speak, and I've enjoyed our interaction greatly. It's been very interesting. You asked very good questions, and I'm deeply appreciative that you really did your homework. And you thought through, and you have your own, and it was very stimulating. So
wonderful. Well, I really much enjoyed it too. And keep doing what you're doing. I think this work, very cutting edge, very pioneering, very important. So thank you for all that you've done.
Yeah.